They say time heals all wounds, but at 80 years old, sitting in my comfortable armchair with arthritis creeping through these weathered hands, I can tell you that some wounds never fully close. They scab over, certainly creating scar tissue that's tougher than the original skin, but underneath the memory of pain remains as fresh as morning dew on Kansas wheat. Today, as autumn sunlight filters through my lace curtains, casting dancing shadows across the hardwood floors, my late husband Harold, laid with his own calloused hands, I find myself compelled to tell this story. Not for sympathy, not for absolution, but because the weight of keeping it locked inside these old bones has become unbearable. What happened to me 65 years ago changed the course of my life in ways I never could have imagined, and what I did in response? Well, that changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. The year was 1943, and I was 15 years old, living on a struggling wheat farm outside Topeka with my mother, Martha Clemens. The war had taken most of the young men from our rural community, including my older brother Thomas, who'd shipped off to the Pacific Theater the previous spring. My father had abandoned us when I was 7, simply vanishing one harvest morning, like morning mist, leaving behind only unpaid bills and a broken-hearted woman who aged 10 years in the span of 10 days. Mother never spoke of him after that first terrible week of searching and calling his name across empty fields, but sometimes I'd catch her staring at the horizon with such profound sadness that it made my chest ache. She'd transformed herself from a delicate farmer's wife into something harder, more resilient, teaching herself to operate the rusted plow and bargain with grain buyers who tried to cheat widowed women. But the farm was dying a slow death, and we both knew it. Our nearest neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchinson, lived 3 miles down a dusty road that turned to treacherous mud whenever Kansas decided to remind us who was really in charge. She was a widow herself, her husband having succumbed to tuberculosis the winter before the war began, and she'd developed an almost supernatural ability to appear whenever disaster struck. "Trouble draws me like honey draws flies," she'd say with that knowing smile that suggested she'd seen enough of life's cruelties to recognize them from miles away. Mother and I had grown to depend on her wisdom and her uncanny ability to show up with a pot of beans or fresh-baked cornbread just when our own pantry looked particularly barren. She had a way of talking that made even the hardest truths sound manageable, wrapping harsh realities in homespun wisdom that somehow made everything feel less terrifying. I remember that particular October evening with crystalline clarity, every detail preserved in my memory, like insects trapped in amber. Mother had spent the day in town trying to negotiate a payment extension with the bank manager, Mr. Cornelius Graves, a thin man with watery blue eyes, who seemed to take genuine pleasure in the desperation of struggling farmers. She'd returned home as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, her face bearing the telltale signs of yet another humiliating encounter with men who held our fate in their soft, uncalloused hands. We ate our meager dinner of beans and cornbread, in relative silence, the weight of our circumstances hanging between us like smoke from a dying fire. I was washing dishes in the chipped porcelain basin when Mother announced she needed to walk over to Mrs. Hutchinson's place to return a borrowed sewing pattern and discuss some matter of mutual concern regarding the upcoming harvest festival. "I'll be back before full dark," she promised, pulling her worn woolen shawl around her shoulders. The evenings had grown chilly, carrying the promise of winter on their breath, and Mother had developed a persistent cough that worried me more than she knew. "Keep the doors locked and don't answer for anyone you don't recognize. There've been reports of drifters in the area, men looking for easy pickings from farms like ours." She paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame, and for a moment I saw vulnerability flicker across her features like candlelight in wind. "Beth, honey, you're growing into a fine young woman, but that means you need to be extra careful. The world isn't always kind to girls like us, especially when we're alone." He assured her I'd be fine, that I had my schoolwork to occupy my time, and that I'd probably be asleep by the time she returned. We'd developed these routines of mutual reassurance, these small rituals of comfort that helped us navigate the uncertainty of our daily existence. After she left, I settled into the kitchen with my arithmetic homework, working by the warm glow of our single kerosene lamp. Mathematics had always come easily to me, the neat precision of numbers, offering a welcome contrast to the chaotic unpredictability of farm life. I was deep in concentration, working through a particularly challenging problem involving compound interest, when I heard the first sound that shouldn't have been there. It started as a subtle creaking from the direction of the front porch, the kind of sound an old wooden house makes as it settles in the evening cool. But then I heard it again, more deliberate this time, followed by the distinct sound of heavy footsteps crossing the weathered boards. My heart began to beat faster, and I found myself straining to hear beyond the normal symphony of night sounds, the cricket chorus, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through wheat stubble. Then came the knock, 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through our small house like gunshots. I froze, remembering Mother's warning about not answering for strangers, but curiosity and a lifetime of rural hospitality warred with caution in my young mind. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to make my voice sound older and more confident than I felt. The response came in a voice I didn't recognize, rough and gravelly, speaking words that would haunt my dreams for decades to come. "Evening, miss. Sorry to bother you so late, but we're having some trouble with our automobile down the road a piece. Wondering if we might use your telephone to call for assistance." It sounded reasonable, the kind of request that would have been perfectly normal in our community where neighbors helped neighbors without question. But something about the voice made my skin crawl, a quality I couldn't identify, but that triggered every primitive warning signal my body possessed. I approached the door cautiously, my bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors, and peered through the small window beside the frame. What I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. 3 men stood on our porch, but they weren't dressed like stranded motorists. They wore dark, mismatched clothing that looked deliberately chosen for concealment, and even in the dim light cast by our porch lamp, I could see that their faces had the hard, predatory look of men who'd lived outside the boundaries of decent society. The one who'd spoken was tall and lanky, with prematurely gray hair and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. The other 2 were younger, but their eyes held the same cold calculation that made my stomach clench with fear. "I'm sorry," I called through the door, backing away instinctively, "but we don't have a telephone. You'll need to continue into town." I heard them conferring among themselves in low voices, and then the scarred man spoke again, his tone taking on a more insistent edge. "Come on now, miss. We know folks out here got telephones. We just need to make one quick call. Won't take but a minute." When I didn't respond, the conversation outside became more animated, and I heard footsteps moving around the perimeter of the house. They were checking windows, testing doors, and I realized with growing terror that these men hadn't come here seeking help. They'd come here seeking something else entirely. It should have run, then should have slipped out the back door and fled across the fields to Mrs. Hutchinson's place, but fear had rooted my feet to the floor like tree trunks. Instead, I stood paralyzed in our small kitchen, listening as they circled our house like wolves stalking wounded prey. The sound of splintering wood from the back door announced their entry, and I heard the scarred man's voice closer, now filled with satisfaction. "Well, well, what have we here? Looks like Christmas came early this year, boys." His companions laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth, and I knew with the terrible clarity that sometimes accompanies impending disaster, that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. They found me cowering behind our kitchen table, a piece of furniture that suddenly seemed as insubstantial as paper. The scarred man, who the others called Harlan, looked me up and down with eyes that made my skin crawl, taking inventory like I was livestock at auction. "Lord have mercy," he drawled, Ain't you a pretty little thing? What's a sweet young girl like you doing all alone out here in the middle of nowhere? I tried to tell them that my mother would be back soon, that neighbors would come looking if they heard trouble. But my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. They found this amusing, exchanging glances that communicated volumes about their intentions. The next few hours exist in my memory as a series of disconnected images and sensations like photographs scattered by wind. I remember the feel of rough hands and the smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco. I remember pleading and the sound of my own voice, high and desperate, begging them to stop. I remember the scarred man's face above mine, his breath hot and fetid, whispering things that no 15-year-old girl should ever have to hear. I remember pain, both physical and something deeper, a kind of spiritual tearing that I wouldn't understand for years. And I remember with perfect clarity the moment when something inside me broke and then immediately began to harden into something else entirely. When it was over, they didn't kill me, which surprised me then, but makes perfect sense now. Dead girls tell no tales, but traumatized ones rarely speak either, and in 1943, Kansas, a girl who'd been violated might as well have had a scarlet letter burned into her forehead. They knew the shame would keep me silent more effectively than any threat. Before they left, Harlan crouched down beside where I lay crumpled on the kitchen floor, his scarred face close enough that I could count the pockmarks on his cheeks. "You been real cooperative, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying mock tenderness. "Now you're going to keep being cooperative by keeping your mouth shut about this little visit. You understand me?" I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he smiled, the expression that was somehow worse than his anger had been. "Good girl. Because if you don't, well, we know where you live now, don't we? And we might just decide to pay another visit when we're in the neighborhood again. Maybe bring along some friends next time." He stood brushing dust from his knees like he'd been gardening instead of destroying a girl's life, and gestured to his companions. "Come on, boys. Time we were moving on. Got a long night ahead of us yet." They left through the front door this time, bold as brass, like they owned the place and everything in it. I lay on that cold kitchen floor for what felt like hours, listening to their voices fade into the distance, waiting for the sound of their automobile starting and driving away. When silence finally returned to our small house, it felt different than before, heavier, somehow contaminated by what had happened within these walls. Every familiar object seemed changed, tainted by association with horror. The kitchen table where I'd been doing homework an eternity ago now looked like a piece of furniture from someone else's house, someone else's life. I eventually found the strength to pull myself upright, and then spent the rest of the night sitting in a corner of the living room, clutching one of Mother's quilts around my shoulders, staring at the door, and waiting for morning to come. When Mother returned the next morning, she'd ended up staying the night at Mrs. Hutchinson's after their conversation had stretched long into the evening. She found me exactly where I'd been sitting for hours, still wrapped in that quilt, staring at nothing. I told her I'd been feeling poorly and had gone to bed early, and she accepted this explanation with the distracted attention of a woman carrying too many worries to focus properly on any single concern. She noticed the broken back door, of course, but I claimed I'd heard a noise during the night and found it that way in the morning, probably the work of drifters looking for easy pickings, just as she'd warned me about. She accepted this too, muttering about the declining state of society and making plans to have the lock repaired. In the days that followed, I discovered that keeping such a secret was like carrying a live coal in your pocket. It burned constantly, consuming everything it touched. I stopped eating regularly, claiming I wasn't hungry when Mother set meals before me. I stopped sleeping well, startling awake at every sound, real or imagined. I stopped speaking, unless directly addressed, and even then my responses became monosyllabic, carefully neutral. Mother attributed these changes to the stress of our financial situation and the general hardships of wartime life, never suspecting that her daughter had been fundamentally altered in the space of a single evening. Mrs. Hutchinson, however, was more perceptive. During one of her regular visits, she studied me with those sharp gray eyes that seemed capable of reading thoughts, and I felt certain she knew something terrible had happened. But she never asked direct questions, never forced me into corner where I'd have to choose between lying and revealing the truth. Instead, she began including me in conversations about the nature of evil, about how some people in this world were broken in ways that couldn't be fixed, and how sometimes good people had to make hard choices to protect themselves and others from such brokenness. At the time, I thought she was simply philosophizing about the war, about Hitler and the Nazis, and the general state of human morality. But looking back, I believe she was planting seeds that would eventually grow into something else entirely. 3 weeks after the attack, I missed my monthly courses. At 15, I was still irregular enough that this didn't immediately cause alarm. But when the second month passed with no sign of bleeding, I knew, with sick certainty, what was happening. I was carrying the child of one of those monsters, and the knowledge felt like swallowing glass. I couldn't tell Mother the shame would have killed her, and the financial burden of another mouth to feed would have driven us into complete destitution. I couldn't tell anyone, because in those days, pregnancy outside marriage was viewed as proof of moral failing on the girl's part, regardless of circumstances. So, I made a decision that haunts me. Still, I began taking long walks in the countryside, looking for specific plants Mrs. Hutchinson had once mentioned in passing, herbs that frontier women had used when faced with impossible choices. The miscarriage happened on a gray November morning, while Mother was at the bank trying to negotiate yet another extension on our loan payments. I was alone in the house when the cramps began, and I knew with relief and terror that my body was rejecting the unwanted seed those men had planted. The pain was extraordinary, like being turned inside out, but I welcomed it as the price of freedom from a burden I couldn't bear. I cleaned up the evidence myself, burying it deep in the fallow field behind our house, and when Mother returned home that evening, I told her I'd been feeling poorly with women's troubles. She made me a cup of willow bark tea and suggested I rest, never suspecting that her daughter had just lived through an experience that aged her decades in the space of hours. That winter passed in a haze of grief and growing anger. The grief was for the girl I'd been before that October evening, a girl who'd believed the world was fundamentally just, and that bad things mostly happened to other people. The anger was harder to define and more dangerous to carry. It started as a small, hot coal in my chest, barely noticeable among all the other emotions competing for attention. But as weeks turned to months, and as I began to understand that justice was not going to arrive on its own, that anger began to grow and change, feeding on every small indignity and frustration, until it became something almost alive, something that whispered to me in the dark hours before dawn. Mrs. Hutchinson seemed to sense this transformation happening within me. During her visits, she'd study my face with increasing concern, and sometimes I'd catch her exchanging meaningful glances with Mother when she thought I wasn't looking. Finally, in early spring of 1944, she took me aside for one of her characteristic heart-to-heart conversations. We were sitting on her porch shelling peas for supper when she suddenly set down her bowl and fixed me with those penetrating gray eyes. "Beth, honey," she said in that gentle but direct way she had, "I've been watching you these past months, and I'm worried about you. You're carrying something heavy, and it's changing you in ways that concern me." I started to protest, to offer some deflecting explanation about worry over the farm and the war, but she held up a weathered hand to stop me. "I've lived long enough to recognize certain signs," she continued, "and I see them in you clear as day. Whatever happened to you, whatever someone did to hurt you, it's eating you alive from the inside. And more than that, it's turning you into something you never intended to become." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. There are two ways to respond to great harm, child. You can let it poison you until you become just another source of pain in this world, or you can find a way to transform that poison into something useful, something that serves justice, rather than just serving revenge. Ah, her words hit me like physical blows, mainly because they were so accurate. I had been transforming, though I hadn't fully acknowledged it even to myself. The frightened, traumatized girl who'd huddled in a corner that October night had been gradually replaced by something harder, more calculating. I'd been studying people differently, noticing their weaknesses and vulnerabilities, imagining how they might be hurt or manipulated. I'd been paying attention to conversations about crime and punishment, about how the law worked and where it failed. And late at night, when sleep eluded me, I'd been fantasizing about finding those three men and making them pay for what they'd done to me. Mrs. Hutchinson, I said quietly, still focusing on the peas in my lap. What would you do if someone hurt you real bad and you knew they were never going to face any consequences for it? What would you do if you knew they were probably out there hurting other people the same way and nobody was going to stop them? She was quiet for a long time, her fingers working automatically at her own bowl of peas, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience I wouldn't understand for many years. I reckon I'd want to hurt them back, she admitted. That'd be the natural human response, but wanting something and doing something are different creatures entirely. But what if wanting it wasn't enough? I pressed. What if you knew that the only way to protect other innocent people was to make sure these particular bad men couldn't hurt anyone ever again? She looked at me then, with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been recognition, or fear, or perhaps both. Beth, she said slowly, are you asking me hypothetically, or are you asking me specifically? The directness of her question caught me off guard, and for a moment I considered telling her everything. But even then, some instinct warned me that certain knowledge once shared couldn't be taken back, and that involving her in my growing obsession might transform her from ally to obstacle. Hypothetically? I lied, and she nodded as though she'd expected that answer. Well, hypothetically speaking, she said, I'd say that justice and revenge might look similar from the outside, but they come from different places in the human heart. Justice seeks to restore balance, to prevent future harm, to serve something greater than personal satisfaction. Revenge serves only the wound itself, and it has a way of creating more wounds than it heals. She set her bowl aside and turned to face me fully. If someone were to find themselves in such a position, hypothetically speaking, I'd advise them to be very careful about which master they choose to serve. Because once you start down that path, it has a way of changing you in ways you can't anticipate or control. Her words stayed with me as spring turned to summer, and summer turned to autumn again. The first anniversary of the attack passed with no recognition from anyone but me, but I marked it privately, using it as a deadline for decision. Either I would find a way to move forward with my life, to let the wound heal as much as possible, or I would commit myself fully to the path that had been forming in my mind since that November miscarriage. I chose the path, and once I'd made that choice, everything else began to fall into place with an efficiency that sometimes frightened me. I began my hunt methodically, understanding instinctively that emotion and impulse would be my enemies in this endeavor. I started by paying attention to local gossip, to stories of break-ins and assaults in neighboring counties, looking for patterns that might suggest the same three men were at work. I volunteered to help at church social functions and community gatherings, positioning myself to overhear conversations between men who might have knowledge of the criminal underworld that operated in our region. I cultivated friendships with girls whose fathers worked as railroad men or traveling salesman occupations that brought them into contact with the kinds of people who lived on society's margins. Gradually, I began to piece together a picture of the criminal networks that operated throughout central Kansas. There were men who specialized in robbing isolated farmhouses, others who ran illegal gambling operations in the back rooms of legitimate businesses, still others who traded in stolen goods and black market commodities made valuable by wartime rationing. It was a shadow world that existed parallel to the respectable society I'd grown up in, and the more I learned about it, the more I understood that my three attackers weren't random drifters, but part of this larger organized community of predators. The breakthrough came in the summer of 1945, more than 18 months after the attack. I was working part-time at Henderson's general store in town, helping Mrs. Henderson manage the inventory and keep the books while her son was overseas with the Army. It was honest work that paid enough to help Mother with household expenses. But more importantly, it gave me access to information I couldn't have gathered from our isolated farm. People talked freely around me, perhaps because I was young and female, and therefore assumed to be uninterested in serious matters, or perhaps because I'd developed a talent for making myself seem harmless and forgettable. On this particular afternoon, two railroad workers were discussing a series of freight car thefts that had been plaguing the yards in Topeka. They were convinced the thefts were inside jobs planned and executed by someone with detailed knowledge of train schedules and cargo manifests. As they talked, one of them mentioned a name that made my blood freeze: Harlan Wicks, a former railroad employee who'd been fired for suspected involvement in previous thefts, but had never been prosecuted due to lack of evidence. The scarred man from my nightmares finally had a full name, and with a name, I could begin to build a real understanding of who he was and where he might be found. I spent the next several weeks using every resource at my disposal to learn everything I could about Harlan Wicks. I discovered that he was originally from western Kansas, born into a family of tenant farmers who'd lost their land during the drought years of the early 1930s. He'd drifted from job to job throughout the Depression, working briefly for the railroad, then for various construction crews, always leaving under suspicious circumstances. He had a reputation for violence and a particular appetite for vulnerable targets. Young women, elderly people, anyone he perceived as weak or defenseless. Most disturbing of all, I learned that the attack on me was far from his first such crime. He was suspected in at least half a dozen similar assaults, stretching back nearly a decade, but had never been prosecuted because his victims were either too frightened or too ashamed to come forward. The more I learned about him, the more convinced I became that Mrs. Hutchinson had been wrong about the distinction between justice and revenge. This wasn't a matter of personal satisfaction or emotional healing. This was about stopping a predator who would continue to hurt innocent people for as long as he remained free to do so. The law had failed repeatedly to protect his victims, and there was no reason to believe it would succeed in the future. If someone was going to stop Harlan Wicks, it would have to be someone willing to step outside the boundaries of legal remedy, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from his permanent removal from the world. I also learned the names of his two companions from that terrible night, Jimmy Carlson and Robert "Bobby" Pike. Carlson was a small-time thief and con artist who'd served several short sentences for burglary and fraud. Pike was the youngest of the three, barely older than me, but with a record of increasingly violent crimes that suggested he was following in Harlan's footsteps. Together, they formed what law enforcement called a wolf pack, a small group of criminals who specialized in targeting isolated victims, people who were unlikely to be missed or whose disappearances could be easily explained by economic hardship and social displacement. By autumn of 1945, I had developed a comprehensive understanding of their habits, their territories, and their methods. They worked in cycles, spending several weeks in one area committing crimes, then moving on before law enforcement could establish patterns or mount effective investigations. They favored small towns and rural areas where police forces were understaffed and communications were poor. They targeted people who lived alone or in isolated circumstances, people who were unlikely to be discovered quickly if something happened to them. And they were currently operating in the area around Lawrence, about 60 miles east of Topeka, a college town where the transient student population provided excellent cover for strangers moving through the community. I requested time off from the general store, telling Mrs. Henderson that I needed to visit a sick relative in Lawrence. Mother was concerned about me traveling alone, especially given the reports of crime in that area, but I convinced her that I was staying with a family from our church and would be perfectly safe. In reality, I had no contacts in Lawrence and no plan beyond finding these 3 men and confronting them with their crimes. I packed a small suitcase with clothing and personal items and hidden beneath the false bottom I'd constructed. I carried a loaded pistol that had belonged to my grandfather, a weapon I'd practiced with in secret throughout the summer, teaching myself to shoot with deadly accuracy. Lawrence, in October of 1945, was a town in transition, swollen with returning veterans and their families struggling to accommodate both economic opportunity and social upheaval. The streets bustled with activity, but there was an underlying tension, a sense that too many people were competing for too few resources. It was exactly the kind of environment where 3 predatory men could operate with relative impunity, blending into the crowd of displaced persons and temporary residents. I rented a small room in a boarding house near the university, presenting myself as a young woman looking for work in the expanding commercial district, and began the process of hunting my hunters. It took me 3 days to locate them. They were staying in a run-down rooming house on the wrong side of town, spending their evenings in a tavern called Murphy's that catered to railroad workers and transient laborers. I observed them for hours, noting their routines, their interactions with other patrons, their apparent hierarchy within their small group. Harlan was clearly the leader, the one who made decisions and gave orders. Carlson was the planner, the one who studied potential targets and developed strategies for approaching them. Pike was the muscle younger and stronger than his companions used for intimidation and violence when more subtle methods failed. Watching them from my concealed position across the street from Murphy's, I was struck by how ordinary they seemed in their daily interactions. They laughed at jokes, complained about the weather, flirted with waitresses, participated in the normal social rituals of working-class men. There was nothing in their public behavior to suggest the capacity for the kind of violence I knew they were capable of inflicting. This ordinariness was perhaps more disturbing than overt menace would have been. It suggested that evil could wear a completely unremarkable face, that monsters could move through society without detection simply by mastering the art of appearing harmless. On my 4th night in Lawrence, I followed them as they left Murphy's and walked toward the residential district near the university. They moved with purpose, clearly executing a plan they'd developed in advance, and I realized with sick certainty that they were hunting again. I watched from a distance as they approached a small house where a single light burned in an upstairs window, the home of someone who lived alone, someone vulnerable, someone about to experience the same terror I'd endured 2 years earlier. In that moment, the abstract concept of justice became immediate and personal. I couldn't prevent what was about to happen to their intended victim, but I could ensure it was the last time they ever hurt anyone. They were surprisingly easy to ambush. Perhaps success had made them careless, or perhaps they simply couldn't imagine that someone might be hunting them with the same methodical patience they used to stalk their victims. I waited until they'd broken into the house and begun their assault. I could hear the muffled sounds of struggle and terror from inside before I made my move. The back door they'd used for entry remained open, providing me with silent access to what I knew would be my moment of reckoning. I found them in the kitchen, having cornered a young woman who couldn't have been much older than myself. She was cowering against the wall, her nightgown torn, her face streaked with tears and terror. Harlan stood over her with that same predatory smile I remembered so clearly, while his companions flanked her like wolves circling wounded prey. None of them heard me enter, so focused were they on their victim and their anticipation of what they planned to do to her. I had several seconds to observe the scene, to feel the full impact of witnessing someone else's version of my own nightmare, before I announced my presence with a single word, "Stop." They turned toward me with expressions of surprise and annoyance, clearly expecting to face another frightened victim, rather than someone holding a loaded weapon with the confidence of practiced familiarity. Harlan's scarred face registered recognition after a moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been respect or fear, or perhaps both. "Well, I'll be damned," he said slowly, his voice carrying that same mocking tone I remembered from 2 years ago. "If it isn't the little farm girl from Kansas. Come back for seconds, sweetheart." "It came back to finish what you started," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, how calm I felt in this moment I'd been anticipating for so long. "I came back to make sure you never hurt another innocent person." He laughed, the sound exactly as cold and empty as I remembered, and gestured for his companions to spread out clearly, intending to overwhelm me through coordinated action. But I'd anticipated this response, had planned for it during all those months of preparation and practice, and I was ready when Pike rushed toward me from the left, while Carlson attempted to circle behind me. The first shot took Pike center mass, dropping him before he'd covered half the distance between us. The second shot caught Carlson in the shoulder as he dove for cover behind the kitchen table, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall with a scream of pain and shock. Harlan stood frozen, clearly reassessing the situation, his predatory confidence replaced by the dawning realization that he was facing someone who'd come prepared for war rather than another helpless victim. "You killed Bobby," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise, as though the possibility that his actions might have consequences had never occurred to him. "You actually killed him." I looked down at Pike's motionless form, feeling less satisfaction than I'd expected, but also less remorse. He'd made choices that led inevitably to this moment, just as I'd made choices that led me here to serve as the instrument of his consequences. "He's not the only one who's going to die tonight," I told Harlan, keeping my weapon trained on his chest. "The only question is whether you're going to make this easy or difficult." What happened next would haunt me for the rest of my life, not because of its violence, I'd prepared myself for that, but because of what it revealed about both Harlan and myself. Instead of begging for mercy or attempting to negotiate, he began to talk, to tell me stories about his life that I didn't want to hear but couldn't ignore. He told me about growing up in poverty so extreme that stealing food was a matter of survival rather than choice. He told me about a father who beat him with a leather strap for imagined infractions, and a mother who abandoned the family when he was 12 years old. He told me about his first arrest at 14, his first prison sentence at 17, his gradual transformation from victim to predator through a system that offered punishment without rehabilitation, condemnation without hope. "I ain't asking for forgiveness," he said, his scarred hands raised in surrender, but his eyes still holding mine with uncomfortable directness. "I know what I done, and I know it was wrong. But I'm asking you to understand that I wasn't born this way, little girl. I was made this way piece by piece, choice by choice, until I didn't know how to be anything else." He gestured toward his wounded companion, who was whimpering and trying to stanch his bleeding shoulder with his shirt. "Jimmy there, he's got a little daughter, maybe 6 years old. Lives with her grandmother down in Arkansas. What happens to her if you kill her daddy tonight?" It felt something crack inside my chest at his words, not from sympathy, but from rage. "You didn't think about anyone's children when you were hurting people," I said through gritted teeth. "You didn't think about the families you were destroying or the lives you were ruining. You made your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences." But even as I spoke these words, I felt the weight of Mrs. Hutchinson's warnings settling over me like a shroud. Was I serving justice? Or was I simply perpetuating the cycle of violence that had created men like Harlan Wicks in the first place? The young woman they'd been attacking, I never learned her name, had retreated to a corner of the kitchen where she crouched in terrified silence watching this confrontation unfold. She was the reason I was here, the representation of all the innocent people these men would hurt if allowed to continue their predatory existence. But she was also a witness to whatever choice I made next, someone who would carry the memory of my actions for the rest of her life. Did I have the right to transform her from victim to witness to summary execution? Did I have the right to burden her with the knowledge of what I was capable of doing in the name of justice? The moment of decision stretched between us like a taut wire, and I felt the full weight of moral complexity pressing down on my 18-year-old shoulders. I had come here with clear intentions and righteous anger, but confronted with the reality of what I was contemplating, I found myself hesitating. This wasn't the clean, simple justice I'd envisioned during all those months of planning and preparation. This was messy and complicated and morally ambiguous in ways that made my head spin and my stomach clench with uncertainty. Then Harlan made the choice for me. Perhaps he interpreted my hesitation as weakness, or perhaps he simply couldn't resist one final attempt to assert dominance over the situation. He lunged toward the young woman in the corner, clearly intending to use her as a human shield, and in that instant, all my moral uncertainty evaporated like morning mist. I fired twice more, both shots finding their target, and Harlan Wicks collapsed to the kitchen floor with a look of genuine surprise on his scarred face. His last words were barely audible. "Well, I'll be damned." Carlson, wounded and terrified, raised his uninjured hand in surrender. "Please," he whimpered. "I got a family. I got people depending on me. I swear I'll never hurt nobody again if you just let me walk away from this." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but saw only terror and desperation, the same emotions I'd felt 2 years ago in my mother's kitchen. The parallel wasn't lost on me, and for a moment I understood exactly how Harlan must have felt when he held power over defenseless victims. The realization was deeply disturbing, but also oddly liberating. I was not him, and I could choose to respond differently than he had. "You're going to leave Kansas," I told him, keeping my weapon trained on his chest, but allowing my voice to carry something other than lethal intent. "You're going to go back to Arkansas or wherever you came from, and you're going to find honest work and live an honest life. Because if I ever hear of you hurting another innocent person, if I ever learn that you've gone back to this kind of life, I will find you and finish what I started here tonight. Do you understand me?" He nodded frantically, tears of pain and relief streaming down his face, and I felt the first stirring of something that might eventually become peace. I helped the young woman to her feet and made sure she was physically unharmed before turning my attention to practical matters. There were 2 bodies on her kitchen floor and a wounded man who needed medical attention, and I had to make decisions about how to explain this situation to authorities. The truth that I'd tracked these men across 2 states with the intention of executing them would likely result in murder charges despite the circumstances of their crimes. But lying would implicate an innocent victim in a cover-up that could destroy her life just as surely as the assault she'd already endured. In the end, we settled on a version of events that was true in all essential details, but carefully edited to protect both of us from unwanted legal complications. She would tell investigators that she'd awakened to find 3 men breaking into her house, that there had been a struggle during which shots were fired, and that 2 of the intruders had been killed, while the 3rd escaped with wounds. I would disappear before the authorities arrived, taking with me any evidence that might contradict this narrative. It wasn't perfect, but it was survivable for both of us, and it had the additional advantage of being substantially accurate. Before I left Lawrence that night, I made one final stop at the boarding house where the 3 men had been staying. I searched their room methodically, looking for evidence of other crimes, other victims who might never receive justice if their stories died with Harlan and Pike. What I found in a battered suitcase beneath Pike's bed made me physically ill photographs and personal items that had clearly been taken as trophies from previous assaults. There were at least a dozen different victims represented, maybe more, spanning several years and multiple states. Some of the photographs showed girls who couldn't have been much older than I'd been during my own assault. He gathered all of this evidence and delivered it anonymously to the Lawrence police station, along with a detailed letter explaining what each item represented and how it connected to unsolved crimes throughout the region. I didn't sign the letter or provide any information that could be traced back to me, but I made sure the authorities would have everything they needed to provide closure for families who'd been waiting years for answers about their missing daughters. It was a small act of justice, but it felt important, a way of honoring the memory of victims who'd never had the opportunity to seek their own revenge. I returned to Topeka the following morning, taking a circuitous route that allowed me to dispose of the weapon I'd used and any other physical evidence that might connect me to the events in Lawrence. I arrived home to find Mother in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, and the normalcy of this domestic scene felt almost surreal after the violence of the previous night. She asked about my trip, and I told her that my relative was recovering nicely, and that I'd decided to return home earlier than planned because I was homesick. She accepted this explanation with the same distracted attention she'd given to most of my stories over the past 2 years, and I realized that keeping secrets had become second nature to me. The news of the Lawrence incident appeared in regional newspapers over the following weeks, reported as a home invasion gone wrong, with 2 suspected criminals dead and a third still at large. The discovery of the trophy collection made larger headlines as investigators began connecting the evidence to cold cases throughout Kansas and neighboring states. Several families received closure about missing daughters, and at least one pending investigation was resolved when DNA evidence linked Pike to a murder that had puzzled authorities for 3 years. I read these reports with mixed feelings, satisfaction at the justice being served, but also a growing understanding of how complex and far-reaching the consequences of violence could be. The months following my return from Lawrence were marked by a gradual transformation in my relationship with Mother and with life in general. The burning anger that had consumed me for 2 years began to cool, replaced by something more sustainable, a quiet determination to build a meaningful life, despite the trauma I'd experienced. I returned to work at Henderson's General Store with renewed focus and began making plans for my future that extended beyond simply surviving each day. I also found myself paying closer attention to Mother's struggles, recognizing that my obsession with revenge had blinded me to her own pain and resilience. Mrs. Hutchinson noticed the change in me almost immediately. During one of her regular visits, she studied me with those penetrating gray eyes and remarked that I seemed settled in a way I hadn't been for a long time. "Whatever was eating at you seems to have worked itself out," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. "I hope you found what you were looking for, and I hope it was worth the price you paid for it." I assured her that I was fine, that I'd simply needed time to process the various stresses of growing up during wartime, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation. Still, she didn't press for details, and I was grateful for her discretion. In the spring of 1946, an unexpected visitor arrived at our farm, a young woman about my age traveling alone, asking for directions to the Clemens place. When I told her she'd found it, she introduced herself as Rebecca Wicks and explained that she was looking for information about her father, Harlan Wicks, who had disappeared several months earlier. The name hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I felt certain that my carefully constructed new life was about to collapse around me. But as I studied her face, I realized that whatever she knew or suspected, she wasn't here as an agent of law enforcement or revenge. Rebecca was strikingly beautiful with dark hair and intelligent green eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of her father's predatory gaze. But there was also something vulnerable and hopeful in her expression that suggested she'd been shielded from the worst aspects of Harlan's character. She explained that she'd been raised by her grandmother in western Kansas after her mother died in childbirth, and that her contact with her father had been limited to occasional visits and irregular financial support. She'd recently turned 18 and inherited a small amount of money that allowed her to travel, and she'd decided to try to locate her father and perhaps establish a more meaningful relationship with him. "I know he wasn't perfect," she said as we sat in our small parlor mother, serving tea and trying not to appear too curious about this unexpected guest. "Grandma always said he had troubles, that he made bad choices when he was younger. But people can change, can't they? People can become better than they were." The innocent hope in her voice was heartbreaking, and I found myself struggling with the knowledge of what I'd have to tell her, not the complete truth which would destroy her illusions while serving no useful purpose, but enough truth to help her understand that her father was beyond redemption. Over the next several hours, I learned Rebecca's story, and through her story, I began to understand aspects of Harlan's history that complicated my simple narrative of good versus evil. She told me about growing up in poverty with an aging grandmother who worked as a seamstress to support them both, about wondering why her father never visited for more than a few days at a time, about the presents he would bring, expensive toys and clothing that seemed inconsistent with his apparent lack of steady employment. She told me about the questions she'd learned not to ask, the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, the gradual realization that other families didn't operate the way hers did. Most surprisingly, she told me about letters her father had written to her over the years, letters that revealed a side of his character I'd never suspected. In these letters, he expressed love and concern for her welfare, regret over his inability to be a more present father, and hope that she would make better choices than he had. He'd encouraged her education, praised her accomplishments, and consistently urged her to stay close to her grandmother and the stable moral influence she represented. It was as though he'd recognized his own corruption and was determined to protect his daughter from contamination by association. The last letter I received was different. Rebecca continued, pulling a worn envelope from her traveling bag. "It arrived about 6 months ago, and it sounded almost like he was saying goodbye. He wrote about mistakes he'd made and people he'd hurt, and he said if anything ever happened to him, I should remember that he'd tried to be a better man than his actions suggested. He also mentioned that he had a half-sister. He'd never met someone who might be able to help me understand his story if I ever needed to know the truth about him." The letter she showed me was written in Harlan's unmistakable handwriting, and as I read it, I felt the foundations of my understanding shift in ways that were both disturbing and oddly comforting. In the letter, he admitted to terrible things he'd done to innocent people, acknowledged that he'd caused more pain than any one man has a right to cause, and expressed hope that his death, which he seemed to anticipate, might somehow balance the scales of justice. Most shocking of all, he revealed information that connected him to my own family in ways I'd never suspected. According to the letter, Harlan's mother, Rebecca's grandmother, had been briefly married to a man named Thomas Clemens before her marriage to Harlan's father. Thomas Clemens was my grandfather-mother's father-in-law, which meant that Harlan and mother were step-siblings, and Rebecca and I were related through this complicated family connection. The revelation explained why Harlan had targeted our farm specifically. Rather than choosing it randomly, he'd known who we were, known that we were family, and had assaulted me despite this knowledge, or perhaps because of it. The discovery that I'd killed my own step-uncle, that the man who'd destroyed my innocence, was connected to me by blood and family history, created a moral vertigo that threatened to overwhelm my carefully constructed sense of justice. Had I been an instrument of righteous vengeance, or simply another link in a chain of family violence that stretched back generations? Had Harlan's assault on me been random predation, or some twisted form of family punishment for perceived wrongs committed decades earlier? These questions had no clear answers, but they forced me to reconsider everything. I thought I understood about guilt-innocence and the complex web of causation that connects human actions across time. I decided to tell Rebecca a version of the truth that would give her closure without destroying her completely. I explained that her father had indeed been involved in criminal activities, that he'd been killed during the commission of a crime several months earlier, and that his death had probably saved other innocent people from becoming victims. I told her about the trophy collection that had been discovered with his body, about the families who'd received closure because of his death, and about the likelihood that he would have continued hurting people if he'd lived longer. But I also told her about the letters he'd written about his apparent love for her, and about the possibility that some part of him had remained capable of genuine human emotion despite his terrible actions. She listened to all of this with remarkable composure, asking occasional questions, but mostly just absorbing information that must have been shattering to receive. When I finished speaking, she sat quietly for several minutes, staring out our kitchen window at the wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon. Finally, she turned back to me with tears in her eyes, but determination in her voice. "I need to know," she said quietly. "Did he suffer when he died? I know that probably sounds terrible considering what he did to people, but he was still my father, and I can't help caring about his last moments." The question caught me off guard, forcing me to confront aspects of that night in Lawrence I'd tried not to dwell on. Had Harlan suffered, he'd died quickly, more quickly than his victims had when he'd terrorized them, but his final expression had been one of surprise rather than pain. "I think it was fast," I told her honestly. "I don't think there was time for suffering." She nodded, seeming to find some comfort in this information, and I realized that mercy could take many forms, including the mercy of not inflicting unnecessary emotional pain on the innocent relatives of guilty men. Rebecca stayed with us for 3 days, and during that time, I watched her process grief and revelation in ways that reminded me of my own journey through trauma and recovery. She was intelligent and thoughtful, clearly capable of understanding moral complexity, but she was also young and hopeful in ways that made me want to protect her from the full weight of knowledge I carried. On her final evening with us, we sat on the front porch watching the sunset, and she asked me a question that cut straight to the heart of everything I'd been struggling with. "Beth," she said, using the familiar version of my name as though we'd been friends for years rather than days, "do you think people can ever really change? Do you think someone who's done terrible things can become genuinely good, or are they just pretending until the next opportunity to do harm?" It was the same question I'd been asking myself since that night in Lawrence, the same question that haunted my dreams and colored my interactions with everyone around me. If people couldn't change, then what hope was there for any of us? But if they could change, then maybe I'd killed a man who might have eventually found redemption. "I think people can change," I told her after a long moment of consideration. "But I also think change requires choices, and some people never make the choice to be different than they are. Your father? I think there were parts of him that wanted to change, that genuinely loved you, and wanted to be better for your sake. But there were other parts that couldn't let go of the patterns he'd established, the ways of thinking and acting that had become habit. Maybe if he'd lived longer, maybe if circumstances had been different, he might have found a way to become the man he wanted to be in his letters to you. But we'll never know." She accepted this answer with the wisdom of someone who'd learned early that life rarely provided clean conclusions or perfect justice. Before she left the next morning, she asked if she could write to me occasionally, if we might maintain some form of family connection, despite the horrible circumstances that had brought us together. I agreed, recognizing in her request the same hunger for belonging that had driven my own search for meaning in the aftermath of trauma. Over the years that followed, our correspondence became one of the most important relationships in my life, a bridge between the person I'd been before that October night and the person I was still becoming. Through our letters, I learned that Rebecca had used her inheritance to attend teachers' college, that she'd married a kind man who knew her family history and accepted it without judgment, and that she'd built a life dedicated to education and service to her community. She named her first daughter Elizabeth in my honor, a gesture that moved me to tears when I received her letter announcing the birth. In return, I shared my own milestones: my marriage to Harold, a gentle farmer who'd returned from the war with wounds both visible and hidden our struggle to save the family farm, our decision to adopt children when we learned we couldn't have biological ones of our own. Rebecca's letters also revealed that she'd inherited more than just her father's appearance. She'd also inherited his intelligence and his capacity for understanding human complexity. She wrote thoughtfully about questions of justice and mercy, about the cycles of violence that passed from generation to generation, and about the possibilities for redemption that existed even in the most damaged families. Through her perspective, I began to see my own actions in Lawrence not as simple vigilante justice, but as a crucial moment in a larger story about how families and communities dealt with the presence of evil in their midst. The decades that followed were marked by the ordinary struggles and satisfactions of rural life in mid-20th century America. Harold and I worked the farm together, gradually modernizing our operations and achieving a modest prosperity that would have seemed impossible during those desperate years of the early 1940s. We raised 3 adopted children, 2 boys and a girl, and I found in motherhood a form of healing I hadn't expected. Teaching my children about right and wrong, about standing up to bullies, while also showing compassion to the wounded and lost, forced me to articulate moral principles I'd never fully examined in my own life. Mrs. Hutchinson remained a constant presence in our lives until her death in 1967, and her final conversation with me revealed the depth of understanding she'd possessed all along. On her deathbed, she took my hand in her weathered fingers and spoke with the clarity that sometimes comes to people in their final moments. Beth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want you to know that I figured out what happened to you, what you did about it, and why you felt you had no choice. I won't claim to know whether it was right or wrong. That's between you and your conscience and your God, but I will say that you've spent the rest of your life trying to balance those scales, and that counts for something. Her words brought me a form of peace I'd been seeking for more than 2 decades. Mrs. Hutchinson had been the closest thing to a moral authority in my life, and knowing that she understood and, if not approved, at least accepted my choices, helped me finally put to rest some of the guilt and uncertainty that had haunted me since that night in Lawrence. I'd spent my adult life trying to be worthy of the mercy I'd been given, the mercy of surviving, of building a family, of finding meaning in service to others, and her acknowledgement suggested that my efforts had not been in vain. Mother lived until 1978, long enough to see her grandchildren graduate from high school and to know that the farm would continue in family hands for another generation. In her final years, she developed a clarity about the past that had been absent during the difficult decades of struggle and survival. During one of our last meaningful conversations, she surprised me by revealing that she'd always suspected something terrible had happened to me during those months when I'd been so withdrawn and angry, and that she'd respected my privacy while hoping I would eventually find a way to heal. I failed you, she said with characteristic directness, sitting in her wheelchair on the porch we'd rebuilt twice over the decades. I was so focused on keeping us fed and housed that I didn't pay enough attention to what was happening in your heart and soul. A mother should protect her children from more than just poverty and hunger, and I didn't protect you from whatever hurt you so badly. I assured her that she'd done everything she could with the resources available to her, that survival itself had been an achievement during those desperate years, but I could see that she carried regrets that no amount of reassurance could fully address. After Mother's death, I found myself in the strange position of being the family historian, the keeper of memories and stories that connected past to present. I spent hours going through old documents and photographs, trying to piece together the complete story of our family's experience during those difficult decades. It was during this process that I discovered additional correspondence between my grandfather and Harlan's mother letters that revealed the extent of their relationship and the circumstances of its end. The story that emerged was more complex and tragic than I'd imagined, involving a young couple separated by economic hardship and family disapproval leaving wounds that apparently influenced the next generation's choices in ways no one had anticipated. Understanding this history didn't excuse Harlan's actions or diminish the harm he'd caused, but it did provide context that made his behavior comprehensible, if not forgivable. He'd grown up hearing stories about the Clemens family, about opportunities lost, and relationships severed by pride and circumstance. In his damaged mind, attacking me might have seemed like settling an old family score. Or perhaps he'd simply been drawn to us because we represented the kind of stability and respectability he'd been denied. Either way, the knowledge helped me understand that even the most seemingly random acts of violence often had roots that stretched back through generations of hurt and misunderstanding. Harold died in 1995, leaving me to face the final decades of my life as a widow in a world that had changed beyond recognition from the one I'd grown up in. Our children had established their own families and careers in distant cities, visiting regularly, but living lives shaped by opportunities and challenges that would have been unimaginable during my youth. I remained on the farm, cared for by hired help, and sustained by memories that seemed to grow more vivid and significant with each passing year. Rebecca and I continued our correspondence until her death in 2003, and through our letters, I watched her grapple with many of the same questions about justice and redemption that had shaped my own life. She'd become a teacher, then a principal, then a school superintendent, dedicating her career to breaking cycles of poverty and violence through education and opportunity. Her own children had grown up knowing the truth about their grandfather, but also knowing that family history didn't determine individual destiny, that each person had the power to choose who they wanted to become, regardless of the sins or virtues of their ancestors. Now at 80 years old, I find myself returning to those events of 1943 and 1945 with the perspective that only comes with having lived a complete life. I've seen enough of human nature to understand that most people are neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but rather complex mixtures of impulse and intention shaped by circumstances beyond their control, but still responsible for the choices they make within those circumstances. Harlan Wicks was a damaged man who chose to damage others, rather than seeking healing for his own wounds. Jimmy Carlson was a weak man who allowed himself to be led into evil, rather than finding the courage to choose a different path. Bobby Pike was a young man who might have become something better if he'd lived longer, or might have become something worse, we'll never know. And I was an 18-year-old girl who chose to take justice into her own hands when the legal system failed to protect innocent people from predators. Was that choice right or wrong? I've spent 65 years considering that question, and I still don't have a definitive answer. I know that 2 men are dead who might otherwise have lived to hurt many more innocent people. I know that families received closure about missing daughters because of evidence discovered after their deaths. I know that at least one man, Jimmy Carlson, apparently did change his life and never committed another violent crime based on investigative reports I tracked down years later. But I also know that I transformed myself into someone capable of killing without legal authority or moral certainty. And that transformation changed me in ways that influenced every relationship and decision for the rest of my life. I became more cautious, more suspicious, more aware of the potential for violence that exists in all human interactions. I became someone who could recognize predatory behavior from subtle cues that most people missed, and I used this knowledge to protect my own children and grandchildren from dangers they never knew existed. Whether this heightened awareness was a gift or a curse, I'm still not certain. What I am certain of is that the cycle of violence that might have continued through Harlan Wicks ended with me. Rebecca raised children who knew their family history but chose different paths. My adopted children grew up understanding the importance of protecting the vulnerable without resorting to vigilante justice. Their children, my grandchildren, are living lives dedicated to service and compassion, working as doctors and teachers and social workers, people who heal rather than harm. If redemption can be measured in terms of positive influence across generations, then perhaps my choices in Lawrence accomplish something worthwhile after all. Think often about that young woman I saved from Harlan's assault, wondering what became of her life and whether she ever understood the full complexity of what happened in her kitchen that night. I hope she found peace and healing, that she was able to move forward without being defined by those moments of terror. I hope she never learned that her rescuer was also a killer, that she was able to maintain faith in a world where justice sometimes arrives through divine intervention rather than human calculation. She deserved to believe in miracles rather than vigilantes. As I prepare to leave this world and face whatever judgment awaits beyond it, I'm struck by how much my understanding of justice and mercy has evolved over these many decades. The angry girl who tracked 3 men across Kansas with murder in her heart has been replaced by an old woman who understands that healing is more important than punishment, that forgiveness even of unforgivable acts is more powerful than revenge. But I also understand that sometimes, in extreme circumstances, good people must be willing to do difficult things to protect innocence from evil, and that the burden of such choices must be carried with humility rather than pride. My final surprise came just last month when Rebecca's daughter Elizabeth, my namesake, visited to tell me that she'd decided to write her family story as part of a doctoral dissertation on intergenerational trauma and recovery. She wanted my permission to include my part of the narrative, and she wanted to know if I had any regrets about the choices I'd made all those years ago. Looking into her face so similar to her grandmother's, but filled with hope rather than hardness, I realized that redemption sometimes takes multiple generations to fully manifest, but that it can indeed transform even the most damaged family histories into something approaching wholeness. I regret that violence was necessary, I told her honestly. I regret that the legal system failed so completely that vigilante justice seemed like the only option. I regret that your grandfather never found a way to heal from his own trauma without inflicting trauma on others. But I don't regret protecting innocent people from a predator who would have continued hurting them if given the chance. And I don't regret the life that grew out of those ashes, your grandmother's life, your mother's life, your life. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that transform tragedy into hope, and I think that's what our family has managed to accomplish over these many years. So here, in the fading light of my 81st year, I offer this account not as justification or condemnation, but as testimony to the complex ways that human lives intersect across time and circumstance. We are all connected by threads of causation that stretch back through generations, and we are all responsible for choosing how we respond to the inheritances, both harmful and healing, that we receive from those who came before us. My story is ending, but it will continue through Elizabeth's research, through the children and grandchildren who carry forward the lessons learned from our family's journey through darkness into something approaching light, and through the recognition that even the most broken people and circumstances can become sources of wisdom and redemption if we're willing to look honestly at what we've done and learned and become. The gang of thieves who raped me during a home invasion thought they were destroying a 15-year-old farm girl, but they were actually creating someone who would spend her life standing between predators and their victims. Someone who would raise children and grandchildren, committed to justice and healing, someone who would transform personal tragedy into multi-generational resilience. I tracked them down and stopped them, but more importantly, I learned to build something better from the pieces of what they tried to destroy. That perhaps is the truest form of justice, not punishment that mirrors harm, but transformation that creates good from evil and hope from despair. And now, as this long story finally reaches its end, I can say with certainty that the light has indeed overcome the darkness, and that redemption, however long delayed, has finally come full circle.